It's on. Right, jolly good. Well, thank you all for coming, especially after that fascinating presentation by Lorenzo. Always a delight to hear Lorenzo. I tend to follow him around the world, listening to the same presentation, but it's always different, and that's a good thing about Lorenzo's presentations. So I'd like to welcome you to this panel on the sharing economy and what sort of regulatory framework that Europe should be looking at for it. I am joined today by three very distinguished people, far more distinguished than I am. To my left is Professor Milorad Katnic. He's a professor here at UDG and president of the board of directors of the Societe Generale Montenegro Bank. After 4 years, he worked in the first economic think tank in Montenegro, the Institute for Strategic Studies and Prognoses. He then served as Deputy Minister of Finance, 2004 to 2010, Minister of Finance from 2010 to 2012, and advisor to the Prime Minister for Economy and Finance from 2012 to 2014. So far more distinguished than me. To my right is Cris Lingle, another very distinguished person. He received his doctorate in economics from the University of Georgia in 1977, and since then he has been probably a peripatetic philosopher, I think is probably the best way of putting it, employed at universities in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the USA. He's currently a professor of economics at the Universidad Marroquín in Guatemala, and he always likes to say he's a passionate supporter of human creativity and volunteer actions that lead to social harmony. And on my far right is Henrique Schneider. He is the head of economic policy at the Swiss Federation of Small and Medium Enterprises. He publishes regularly on Austrian economics, Asia, and international politics. His latest book, which might be a tad relevant to this discussion, is Creative Destruction and the Sharing Economy, a book on Schumpeter, sharing economy, Uber, innovation, and regulation. It applies the Austrian School of Economics, without being militant, to the actual discussion of what the sharing economy is and how to deal with it. For those of you who don't know me, I am Iain Murray. I'm a vice president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. I have been there for about 20 years, having fled the country, the UK, when Tony Blair got elected. So I thought we'd start this, this session with a small bit of interactivity, obviously not nearly as interactive as this morning, but let's do what we did this morning and define our terms a bit and ask, what is the sharing economy? So if I can just throw it open to you, what's the first name that comes to mind when you hear sharing economy? Uber, yes. Any others? Airbnb. Bitcoin, that's interesting. What are the identifying characteristics of the firms and the other institutions that you have mentioned? Can you think of what are the real identifying characteristics about them? Yeah,
they allow people to use existing capital and sell it or rent it to willing customers.
Or even share it with them.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yes, any other characteristics?
Peer-to-peer.
Peer-to-peer, very important characteristic. Any others?
Disruptive.
Disruptive, very important. What about how you interact with them?
Use the internet.
Sorry,
They use the internet.
they use the internet, yes, or other modern communications devices. How do you pay for these transactions? Yes, there's always an electronic payment component involved in them. I think I think we've identified a lot of the important characteristics that go into these firms. Now, let's think a little bit more broadly. Can you think of some other firms that share these characteristics that we've identified? eBay, yes, well done. How would you characterize eBay? Would you think of it as a sharing economy firm normally? No. What about TripAdvisor? TripAdvisor, these days you can actually book your hotel through TripAdvisor. Groupon, that's an interesting one. What about, there's one characteristic that a lot of these firms and institutions share that we haven't mentioned yet. How do you know that somebody that you're dealing with through one of these firms is reputable? The rating system, yes. And that's why I think eBay and some of the other firms that we mentioned, TripAdvisor, which include a rating system, they share a lot of the characteristics of sharing economy firms as well. So when you think about it that way, you can think that the sharing economy isn't just about sharing, the very first thing that Alex mentioned. It isn't just about sharing capital. It's something a bit more fundamental than that that's going on, which allows us to think of Uber, Airbnb, Lyft in the same way that we should be thinking about eBay, Etsy, Amazon Markets, TripAdvisor, a lot of other firms that we normally don't think of as being part of the sharing economy. So I think there's a conceptual challenge when it comes to the first principles that you need to think about when you're looking at how we should be regulating the sharing economy. As we say, most people know Uber, Lyft, Airbnb. They all share certain characteristics, but the most important part is that all of these are platforms. They facilitate economic transactions between others. They create transactions that would not have taken place without the existence of the platform. I would not be able to get a lift from somebody and pay him for it who I don't know and have no idea who to trust from work to home if it weren't for Uber. I wouldn't be able to get in touch with somebody who makes the Chinese leatherwork donkey skin stuff that I've bought for my wife on eBay, because there is just no market for that in my local area. But the market is created by the existence of the platform eBay. So we need to think eBay, Amazon Markets, Etsy, and others when we start thinking about regulation of the sharing economy. And we must always avoid the temptation to think of Uber as a taxi firm because that's what it looks like, or Airbnb as a hotel firm because that's what it looks like. They're not, they're platforms. And the creation of these platforms is actually taking us back to an earlier period of economic transactions. Everything old is new again. Before industrialization and mass unemployment, most economic transactions were between individuals. You would go to a market for something, a literal market, to find what you wanted. You would find the person who they themselves produced it at that market, and you would do the transaction yourself. The market was, in many ways, a medieval platform to allow these things. But that was before industrialization and mass employment. The economic term for this is a two-sided market. You have a market on one side and a market on the other. And when you read Adam Smith, he talks about the system of natural liberty, this system of natural liberty where you create something and you transact with somebody else for that. But industrialization changed things. Industrialization led us to think of transactions as not between you, the individual, and another individual. You began to think of transactions as between a customer and a firm. So because of that, we and regulators tend to think of Uber and Airbnb as the entity that we are doing business with, not with the individual businessman, the driver, or the person who owns the house, or the businessman on eBay. We will think of Uber, Airbnb, and eBay as the entity that we are doing business with. But we're not. We're actually going back to that old market-based system before the industrial era. So we're reverting to an older model. The trouble is, regulation is all based around this newer model. And this is why thinking of platforms as a firm is a serious mistake. Regulators want something to regulate. It's in their nature. It's like the scorpion crossing the river on the back of the alligator. It stings the alligator. They both drown. The alligator's last words were, "Why did you do that?" The scorpion says, "It's in my nature." The regulators want something to regulate. As we say in the US, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So 3 examples. To an employment regulator, Uber looks like an employer of drivers. To a taxi regulator, Uber looks like a taxi firm. To a trade union, Uber drivers look like people they can organize and get dues from. But this is disempowering to those individual businessmen. Treating Uber as an employer of drivers means that you, as a driver, have to be employed by Uber. That's something very different from the business arrangement that you went into. Similarly with taxi regulators and trade unions. You're disempowering the individual businessman who has been empowered by the platform. And platforms provide huge benefits. As we've already discussed, they disrupt highly regulated industry sectors. The phenomenon of regulation and regulatory capture on both sides is well known. You get very comfortable with your regulator. You try to help out your regulator tries to help out you, and the customers get forgotten about. Disrupting highly regulated industry sectors is a major benefit of these platforms. It's creative destruction, and I know Henrique will be talking more about that later. They provide considerable work opportunities for individual businessmen. The platforms empower you to do something that you did not have the capacity to do before. You, as a driver, suddenly realize that you have capital that you can use to provide a return on that investment. That possibility wasn't there before. And they provide enormous flexibility that a 9-to-5 job does not. The thing about employment law is it is all based on the idea that you are selling your time to your employer. That's the basis of employment law in virtually every country. When people talk about wage slaves, normally trade unionists talk about wage slaves, they actually have a bit of a point, because you are selling your time to the employer who is able to ask you to do virtually anything with that time. But when you use a platform to promote your business, you get the flexibility that a 9-to-5 job does not give you. If you're a working mother, having the ability to drive for Uber at certain times and not at others is tremendously important. You can take your children to school. You can be there for them in the afternoon if you have a crazy system like the US does, where children get kicked out of school at 2 o'clock and they're left on their own for 3 hours. That's very important. And as such, they actually reduce the need for welfare and things like the minimum wage. People who are no longer employed in a 9-to-5 job, who previously would have gone on unemployment, are increasingly turning to Uber and other sharing economy providers to provide an income stream while they look for their next job. And increasingly as well, people are deciding they like the flexibility and not looking for that next job. Under the old system, these people would have been on welfare. There's also a lot of people who don't necessarily want to work for minimum wage. They may have rather fewer skills than somebody would require to pay minimum wage to. Immigrants, for example, who don't really speak the language, they might find it very difficult to get a job on minimum wage. They find it much easier to do business through a platform. And they stimulate innovation in other areas. As we've seen, a lot of firms have said, "Oh, if Uber can do that for cars, what can I do with it?" And so we've seen an explosion of platforms simply trying to replicate the Uber model in other areas. My wife, for instance, was involved for about a year as marketing director for the Uber for health coaches. Health coaches who provide dietary and nutrition advice and so on. They suddenly were able to provide that advice to people well out of their geographic area, thanks to the introduction of that app. Excuse me. So when we're thinking about what regulation of the sharing economy should look like, I think that the central principle is let platforms be platforms. And that's why I think the correct framework is actually deregulatory rather than regulatory. Government should instruct regulators to back off. They should tell the taxi regulator that, no, this isn't a taxi firm, stop regulating it. They should tell the hotel industry, Airbnb is not, the hotel regulators, Airbnb isn't a hotel firm, back off. And they should instead do something that has been used a lot in the financial technology, well, not as much as it should have been, but has been used in the financial technology area, and create a regulatory sandbox for platforms. If you qualify as a platform, you're allowed to play in this sandbox to, however you would like, as long as you don't go outside the walls of the sandbox. That's been used in fintech, certainly by several governments, to develop the fintech sector. It can also be used for the platform sector. It's important that we reform labour and employment law. We need to recognise the existence of two-sided markets in these areas, and the platforms are not employers, and therefore should not be subject to employment law. Unfortunately, a lot of court cases around the world, because employment law was basically written during that period of mass industrialization, these court cases are deciding that people are employees rather than independent businessmen. And I think this is extremely important. Platforms have to exercise self-discipline as well. They need to resist the temptation to act like employers. Quite often you find that the firms, once they get established, start providing extra benefits to people who work with them that make them look, for employment law terms, much more like employers than platforms. There's a lot of worry about where Uber drivers, for instance, get certain employment benefits. This is also leading to the conclusion of some regulators that Uber has to be treated like an employer to force them to provide benefits. But we can let the market work that out. It used to be the case that markets provided a huge amount of employment benefits. Before the welfare state, friendly societies and others existed that delivered benefits to independent businessmen. This can happen again. We just need to let the market develop these ways. So the government should step back and let the market work this out. And finally, platforms mustn't ask to be regulated themselves. It's the classic occasion of a disruptive new entrant wipes away the previous incumbents in the field, and then they turn around to the regulators and say, well, okay, what sort of deal can we strike to make sure that we can maintain our place and not be knocked down by the next disruptor. So I think it's important for us as free marketers to talk to the platforms and suggest to them that they really shouldn't ask to be regulated. So this is the resource bank. Here's a resource. Here's an idea of how to make this case to your governments and regulators. First of all, you need the analytical background. You need to produce the white papers. Look at the platform economy in your country. Look at employment law in your country and how it works. Look at other regulations that stand in the way. And we in the United States stand ready to help with that. If you would like some advice on writing a white paper, I or a bunch of others who work in this space would be only too happy to help you. Will Reinhardt at the American Action Forum, Jared Mayer at the Foundation for Government Accountability, Cris at the Mercator Center, 3 really intelligent young men whose, I think their total ages are less than mine. But they'd all stand ready to help alongside me if you want some help on producing an analytical white paper. But you need to go further. Build a coalition of people who are interested in defending this new platform economy. That may be businessmen who are active in it. It may be other think tanks. It may be the platforms themselves in your country. They may want to help. Work with them, build that coalition, hold events, get the message out that this is something different that's happening. It's not just Uber as a taxi firm. And then, of course, you have to advocate to and with politicians. Find a champion. Find somebody who will be, if your legislatures work this way, find somebody who's willing to sponsor a bill. If you have to go through the government, find a champion in government somewhere. There probably is one if you have a free market party in power. And one thing you can also do, as I mentioned, there's a lot of activity in the law courts around the platforms at the moment. Work to intervene in court cases. Find lawyers who are willing, free market lawyers who are willing to help you pro bono without charge on this, and work with them so that you can intervene in those court cases to point out to the court that this isn't a question of taxi regulation, it's a question of employment and business. So make that case to the court. I think that's something that we just don't do enough of in Europe. So that's my presentation. I think it'd be great if we could now turn over to Milorad for his comments.
Allow me first to thanks for this opportunity.
Do you have one?
Thank you. Allow me first to thanks for this opportunity and particularly for the privilege to participate to this forum and this very interesting panel. I will start with telling you that 4 years ago I started to use this digital or platform sharing economy when I visited Berlin, Berlinale Festival, and for the first time my friends from Berlin suggested me not to rent the hotel room, but to rent through the Airbnb the flat, not to take the usual taxi, but to install the Uber application and to use the Uber drivers or the individuals that drive for the Uber. So I was fascinating about the efficiency of this system and about the business model that they made. At that moment I didn't know that that is theoretically the case for the sharing economy, and that is something what is really dramatically challenging the old traditional way of doing and old economy. Later on, I find out that this is theoretically recognized as a sharing economy, and then I thought, is it just platforms that are a sharing economy? Because in my society and many others, we had a sharing economy, mostly in the gray economy, without the platforms. People stayed at the street, with for example, with the table, rooms, and the individuals approach them and take the room during the touristic season. Also, the drivers, if you stop them on the street, when I was in the Moscow or St. Petersburg, many drivers will stop and they will take few dollars or whatever to drive you wherever you want, especially if you go in their direction. So also they share their capital, physical capital, and their time with you, and you pay for that, similar as in sharing economy. But what is new with this sharing economy is that they are, as you said, main characteristic is that they are now it's based on platforms and digitalized. So it is more, let's say, democratized and more for the mass global market than was before. So it is now with this technology, new technology, more opportunity for many people, and it is for me was very interesting and fascinating. As I said before, this sharing economy, traditional sharing economy, was the most in the gray economy in countries that I know. Today also the part of this digital or sharing economy, platforms economy is not regulated in our countries. So individuals that are participating are, some of them are in dilemma how to approach to this question, what to do regarding the taxation, regarding to register somewhere or whatever. So I investigated a little bit the examples for Montenegro, and we already have the RMB services in Montenegro, and some individuals already offer their apartments, room, or whatever to the market through the RMB platforms. And some of them register as individuals that rent for the tourism purpose their apartment, and they're regularly as others paying taxes on the income that they receive from that activity. So that is, from my point of view, the only, let's say, understandable regulation that I can see from the government side. Because I think from the point of the quality of the service or some damage or whatever, that sharing economy are self-regulated. Because of, you said, these ratings that clients, customers are regulating these platforms, companies, however we call them. If you have bad ratings, if your client is not satisfied, then you pay much more bigger price, value in the company value, whatever, than if some government body makes some statement, decree, or penalize you. So with any not satisfied clients, customers, your price or penalty is much bigger than any what government can issue. So in my case, these are the dilemma. Theoretically, is it sharing economy also that old traditional way of peer-to-peer doing business and using your fixed assets or whatever, money? Because is it also these peer-to-peer platforms that are alternative to the banks to borrow the money, also part of this sharing economy? And is it this just using the new technology to provide more or less the same services? That is on theoretical level. On practical, how to regulate, I think it's the mostly self-regulated, and from the aspect of the taxation, the same as the traditional. And if clients recognize that is in their interest to use the services that is more regulated, like hotels or whatever, or taxi drivers, they can pay more for that, and they avoid with their paying what they prefer. That is for, let's say, introduction. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Milorad. I think that given that I also do some work on the development economics, and given the the importance that international institutions place in trying to formalize economies around the world. I think you have a very insightful comment there, that this is a way to formalize economies and bring them out of the shadows. I turn now to Henrique.
Well, it's good that you turn to me, because I disagree with almost everything you said. Well, no, actually I disagree with everything you said. Let me say, as a moderately self-interested person, that I've written 2 books on the sharing economy and or Uber, and my idea in there is to try to approach it through different lenses. The one is the lens creative destruction, and the other one is the lens of alertness. These are 2 different economic models you can use to explain what's going on. And I found out the following things, and when I tell you this, you don't need to buy the book anymore. First of all economy is about sharing. There is no way an economy works if we don't share stuff. For example, if you go to a restaurant, you are sharing space with other people, and the guy that cooked your food is sharing his food with you. He bought it. Of course, he's not sharing it just because he's a nice person, I'm sure he is, but he's also wanting to make some money with that. And like someone driving Uber, the guy is not just driving you around because he happens to like you, he also wants to make money with that. Think about the shareholders corporation. The first time people came together and put money into a common venture, they even used that word. They were shareholders. They knew that they were sharing stuff. And if you like the Pirates of the Caribbean, and the very first one, they even discussed that. Even these big corporations were formed with people bringing in sometimes material goods. So the captain brought in his ship. That's why he was not only in command of the ship was his. And as a person that shared risk with that particular company, and the movement was the East India Company, the captain was a shareholder because he shared his personal wealth with the company. So the one thing is, everything is shared. Because without sharing, for money, of course, without sharing, there is no point in coming together and exchanging goods, information, data, money, whatever you want to do. The second point is, yes, platforms are platforms, but platforms are firms. They have a rationality too. The platform is not there in order to change the world and make it into a perfect sharing space. The platform wants to make money. I agree, it's not an employer, it's not a hotel, but you have to understand that the platform wants to make money. And the moment you give instruments, I mean now regulatory instruments to the platform is going to use it. There is no way they are not going to use, for example, a sandbox to their own advantage. And that's why we should not give, politically, any instrument to platforms. Rather, we should deregulate the other ones. So the thing is not letting platforms do what they want to do, of course, but that applies to every economic agent. Let them do what they want to do. And if you see that it is possible to have cabs and hotels and restaurants working on this sharing economy thing, then you should deregulate everyone too, the normal economy too. The idea is deregulate and let competition regulate. Let competition, not competition by the textbook of economists, but competition out there in reality in the market do its thing. That's everything I know on this subject. Thank you. Oh yeah, let me show the book. That's good. Here, that's the first book. That's on creative destruction and the sharing economy. Here you find a very lengthy discussion about what is sharing economy, and then my conclusion: everything is sharing. And in this one here, Uber Innovation Society. That's the need for why cooperation is good for everyone.
Well, thank you. I know less about the sharing economy, but I'll fake it. What I'm interested in is trying to use rhetorical devices to get people, the state in this case, legislators, regulators, to do things I think they should do, or stop doing things I think they shouldn't do. So I try to create arguments that will lead them, they believe in a way that they want to go, but I can capture them to go where I want them to be. So I frame the question in terms of the social gains. Of course, it's a presumption that the gains are net gains, that is, but putting the point of social gains alerts status to something that must be good. It's like a nice smell from a bakery. So this is a rhetorical device. And I pose the question about entrepreneurs versus regulators, partly because I think it's very important, and it's been made clear here, but I think it might be important to be very clear in saying we are in favor of regulation. Regulation is good. But we have to understand there's two flavors of regulation, not chocolate and vanilla, but self-regulation or state-imposed regulation. One is better than the other. So we love regulation, but regulation through competition and the market is what we're trying to drive people towards. So we should always speak in favor of regulation in this regard, because regulators love regulation, but then we have to explain to them as well as the general public there are other ways to get there. So let's look at some of these social impacts of. Now, I'm deeply concerned that there's a real problem with the sharing economy. It worsens the income distribution. And I worry about fairness in this regard. Statists think that they are the ones that understand these terms and that they are the ones who must have something to say about correcting the income distribution. Well, let's think about this very carefully. And I think this could even be a good argument in a court of law before a judge, because it might lead them to making better judgments. The sharing economy leads to unfair income distribution and exploitation. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's think about it. The sharing economy moves people away from a monopoly-priced system. For example, Uber takes us away from, say, in major cities where taxi companies are highly regulated and effectively charge what economists call a monopoly price. Okay, so what happens then, is that in economics, we say, well, this is the monopoly price at A, and Uber moves us to price P, where consumers have access to lower prices and capture what is known as consumer surplus. Now, this is a microeconomic phenomenon, but for the sake, and I'm quite allergic to aggregations, but for the sake of this argument, let's imagine this, that a community might achieve something like this. So this is a very substantial gain to the consumer from moving away from a high price set through restrictions on competition to a lower price based upon this innovation. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you here is that the actual consumer surplus that's generated exceeds the gains to the developer of this sharing economy platform or device like Uber. In other words, the community gains much more than the individual developer or the corporation of, say, Uber. So they're actually undercompensated. This is unfair. They create enormous social gains that go far beyond what they actually receive in compensation. And most of us say, no, if I give you something, I should receive just payments in this. And these guys are actually underpaid. Well, it's an argument. Now, the drivers of Uber, for example, they have low risks, right? They own the car already. There's no risk. I mean, it's something they own. It's something they possess. They're not taking any risk at all. But when they join this sharing economy platform, the risks are taken by the developer. So that means that they are exploiting the developer. The developer is the one who absorbs the risk, develops the reputation that the community trusts, and they're being exploited by the drivers. It's an argument. It's a way of trying to twist these argumentations in a way that make your presentation look better in the eyes of someone who understands exploitation in a different way. Earnings from creating apps. This is terrible. They don't create anything physical, right? It's an abstraction. It's digital formats. So we're about a material economy. We measure GDP. There's something wrong about this. There's no real increase in production. Well, of course, this works the other way as well. What it does is it provides the opportunity for gains in wealth from trading or sharing things that already exist. Well, in the eyes of a statist who worships at the altar of sustainability, we should present them with this very clearly. Say, look, this is great. This reduces the strain on resources, on scarce resources. It leads to greater conservation, it increases sustainability, and it reduces the carbon footprint. They love this stuff. So, I think this is one of the ways that we can try to sort of win this debate, by trying to use familiar terminology that reaches to the heart of the statist, the regulator, the state regulator, and try to sort of turn it in our favor. So that's what I know about, and that's my interpretation of this. But I would invite you, now, we may contest some of these arguments, but what I'm trying to present to you is really a strategy in a sense. I mean, these particular examples may not be what we want to rely on, but to try to use language in a way that will be more persuasive so that we can win this argument, and then to carry the suggestions earlier that self-regulation is very effective. Reputation is everything to a corporation, and this is why you need to stress that these are corporations, because somebody, whether it's Uber or Coca-Cola or Nike owns nothing except a trademark. They will protect that to the death. They regulate their behavior, and they have a strong motivation to regulate their behavior because they need to protect that trademark. That is what they own of value. And again, this is a way of saying we need to encourage regulation, but we want to encourage self-regulation through competition and open markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cris. Looks like we have quite a bit of time for questions, so let's open it up to the floor, and it looks like Dia is the first one.
Cris, I love this idea about using their language to sort of make our points clear. And I'm trying to get some context. What do you think of the sort of the arguments that if you start using their language, fairness, carbon footprint, etc., and start producing our arguments using those words, then we kind of accept that those are good barometers and those are the prisms that we need to look at every argument we make through. So should we focus on that, or should we spend quite a lot of time telling people actually those things only matter in the way that you think matters?
Well, I don't know. I suppose one of the reasons I have affection for this approach is that this is what I used debating Marxists when I was young, when that was the main debate. And it tended to be quite effective, that I would, because I had read most of what they read, and they had read nothing of what I had read, that I could take advantage of their ignorance with that and explain and reconstruct the model of exploitation. So instead of the example I used here, I said, well, class struggle is a very interesting thing, but it's how you interpret class. I interpret class in terms of the productive class of workers and entrepreneurs who have shared interests against the ruling class of bureaucrats, politicians, and special interests. So they already accept this idea of class struggle, but then you force them to begin, hang on, no, but then it's very clear. It's quite clear that workers and entrepreneurs' interests are much more closely aligned because they're the producers who are being exploited by the ruling class, and they're having their resources extracted under force. So I guess that's why I like this approach, and I found it to be effective. Now, whether it'll work in this broader argument, I'm not sure, but that's why I do it.
I also want to respond to that, because among the different things I do is I'm a trade commissioner in Switzerland. The trade commission looks at this competition cases and sectorial regulation, for example, in the taxi sector. And there are two peculiar risks to your approach. The risk number one is an epistemic risk. Regulators like using the models they know to describe the world. The more you give them of their models, the more they will use their old-fashioned models to analyze the new economic developments. This is an epistemic risk, so you are translating innovation into old thinking. The second risk, which is much more elevated, is the moment you give regulators, trade commissioners, and people like those, or judges, a vector to enter the regulation of the sharing economy, and even if it's in your sense, you are allowing them to do what they do, which is regulate, and you are allowing companies, for example, the platforms, to buy in or to try to force their regulatory capture. It means the regulators doing what the companies want to do. If all of a sudden the regulators perceive the Uber developers as the guy they need to take care of, the Uber developer is going to use that in his advantage. So these particular risks are there. First of all, the risk of regulators not interpreting this very correctly, and second, the risk of regulatory capture.
I think there's some insight into this question from the work of a social scientist in the United States called Aaron Wildavsky. And he looked at the fundamental values of certain groups in America. And he came to the conclusion that there were four value groups. The libertarian value group, for whom freedom is the most important thing. The egalitarian, for whom fairness is the most important thing. What he called the hierarchist, for whom order and structure is the most important thing. And then the fatalist, who thinks that whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And we can discount those for the purposes of political communication, because they're not really susceptible to political messages. But if you can find a way of expressing the policy that you want people to adopt in a way that appeals to all three main value groups, fairness, order, and freedom, then you've probably got a winning message and can build a winning coalition and take that forward. So, what Cris suggests, I think is valuable, but we mustn't forget those other two value groups, because if you do forget them, then, as Henrique says, the regulators are just going to take advantage of that. Okay, should we get Josh, then Eamon?
Thanks, Iain. Well, I'll just shout. So I think I suffer from a failure of imagination, but if people could just sort of talk or just sort of blue sky about where this could go from here. I mean, it's very exciting as a disruptive model, but beyond Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb, and possibly Bitcoin, where could this go?
I do not have a microphone, so I cannot answer.
It's a sharing thing.
We are sharing here, yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of stuff you can do using platforms, as we have been doing using platforms. But obviously, not everything is platform. There are some services that don't seem platformable from my point of view. But I think you can expand it easily into healthcare, for example. You can expand it easily into other services. Wherever you have bound capacity that people have paid for anyway, and there is any free or capacity, people can share it. I think it's a question of how many platforms will be established per sector and usage. And then there's another thing, maybe we're getting into science fiction now, but the idea of printing, the 3D printing, that might platformize even the manufacturing of stuff. Because the moment people can print stuff at their home, the moment they have this capacity for them, the only thing they need to shop for in these interconnected platforms of sharing are the programs on how to print whatever they want to print. For example, if I want to print a Rolex, I print my own Rolex, provided Rolex is willing to share the plans with me for a fee, and so on. So technology takes turns and goes into many places. We can try to foresee now, but it is as sure as that other stuff will happen we cannot even imagine now.
Yes, I very much agree with that. And when you add artificial intelligence into the play as well, then things get very interesting. You have, at heart, many of these platforms are essentially an algorithm. So you could have an artificial intelligence that you ask to find a better algorithm. So you yourself could come up with a better way of providing the market than Uber does, because you've got an AI that has found it. You could have AIs wandering the streets searching for better algorithms. Your fridge could use an algorithm for purchasing milk when it recognizes it's out, and suddenly start delivering stuff to other fridges in the neighborhood. There's all sorts of things where this could go. We really are in science fiction territory. But I think one really important point that we often forget is that what platforms are doing at the very heart is reducing transaction costs. And if you read all the marvelous work that the great Ronald Coase did on the nature of the firm and the importance of transaction costs in the nature of the firm, then, yes, Coase himself didn't want that taken too literally. But when you start reducing transaction costs considerably, then you're getting into a position where the firm as we know it will change considerably. You'll get to a situation, I think, where you have what my colleague Wayne Cruz calls drag and drop firms that can scale up and scale down very quickly, simply because transaction costs are so small. You've seen something like that happen in the movie business, where the movie studios used to employ everybody in connection with the movie, and even had even owned movie theaters. That's all gone by the board because of reducing transaction costs. And so now production studios are much more nimble and flexible, and you just look at the end credits of any blockbuster movie now, and there are something like 300 firms generally involved in the creation of a movie. It's possible that, in fact I think probable, that other firms will go in similar directions, and we'll have a much more flexible economy and the way firms are set up in it in the future.
Can I add something? Taking that point, one promising area is what you might call organ sharing, where matching donors, or preferably sellers, but donors of organs, where you could register. I mean, it would improve the sort of the transfer process in terms of, and if eventually it was allowed to have a real market in it, but that would be even better. I'll move around with this microphone and you guys share it.
Yeah. I know Eamon had a question.
Yeah.
So.
Well, actually, I've now got 2 points because I want to go back to something that Dia had raised. But first of all, on sharing economies, I think I share your anticipation that something would come along like Airbnb and Uber, and you'd be worried that the sharing economies would not produce something which was a real phenomenon like they are. And I hope, we don't know the future, Iain, and you're absolutely right, that we can't anticipate. But I actually think it's a very, very exciting aspect, a new frontier for the free market, because the disruption it offers to existing business cartels, and that can't be underestimated. I see it back in Ireland. The hotels have locked down on towns and cities, and they're faced with a disruption. The empowerment of citizens as entrepreneurs, using their back rooms to challenge what are, gouging by hotels. You see it in Manhattan. And it's the same with the taxi industry. And the taxi industry is, in Ireland, for example, I think in other countries as well, very high because the state is taking so much tax off it, or has forced these higher rates. And taxi men or women themselves say, I don't want to drive at this price, which is prohibitive. So it's existing big interest. Because always remember, as free marketeers and libertarians, we're also interested in disruption and challenging bigger business interests. And I made this point yesterday to Lydia from Timbro in Sweden, because I was concerned that they are funded by a chamber of Swedish commerce, and they don't take funding then for another 10 years. So it seems to lock out smaller emerging businesses. That's just on sharing economy. So I think it's a very exciting area. Just quickly on Dia's point about language, and echoing what the guys in the panel had said, I absolutely think we should use the language that has been taken by the left and used, like fairness and justice and so-called equality. First of all, it's not left-wing language, it's human language. Everyone's basic human decency is that there's fairness and that there is equality of opportunity. But I turn it on its head. The big issues for us in Ireland are the differential between public pay and private sector pay, because the public service trade unions have the political culture and the government by the balls, and they're making excessive demands now. And I say, if I'm on TV or radio, I say, how is that fair that someone in a hair salon or a private operator has to struggle because their boss can only pay them so much money, whereas a loss-making state post service or a civil service department or a guard or a cop is getting so much more. So that's unfairness. So, and I just think with language, by changing it and tweaking it, you can gain so much more. So when we had our crash and austerity program, and I was on the airwaves fighting for austerity, which is not a good sell, let's be honest, when people have had it good. I said, we don't want cuts, we want savings. We don't support bosses or capitalists, we support job creators. Who can argue against job creators? Who can argue against savings? And every person has to run a household or has to run their pocket and their finances. So I think they relate to it. So I really do think we should go in there and take that language back, that so-called language of the soft left, Thanks a lot.
The chap at the back.
So you actually mentioned how the market itself is a regulation, especially with the sharing economy. What do you think about the viability of using elements of the sharing economy to regulate itself? Maybe the sharing economy for governance. I know there's a blockchain technology called Ethereum, which allows you to make smart contracts that can execute automatically. And you can also, it's very transparent, so regulators could be easily argued, perhaps, to use it. What do you think of the viability?
Anybody want to respond? Or?
No, I think that's something very exciting. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of the work of Professor Jason Potts in Australia, who works with the IPA. He's done some very interesting work on the governance of the blockchain itself, and has realized that it shares a lot in common with Elinor Ostrom's work on the governance of the commons in traditional property terms. So I think there's a potential for very great feedbacks here. If we can get the governance of the blockchain working well, then we can get the governance, we can turn that round into government itself. And the use of rating systems for government was... John Major tried something like that in the UK. It didn't really work, but feedback from citizens to government was potentially useful back then. Now I think there's amazing potential for it. But, do you have any? Alex?
First of all, thanks for, I really liked Iain's definition and the introduction. It made me thinking, and I found it
very interesting and educating. One of the fears that we have as people who we're not pro-business, we're pro-market. Businesses like Uber now are the establishment. They have a lot of money, they spend millions of dollars lobbying. They hire, I think they hired like the former Obama chief of staff.
Yeah, David Plouffe.
So they became as establishment as possible. And I'm sure that in Brussels the same thing happens. We like them because they verify Schubert and creative destruction. They use existing resources to replace older ones in better ways, more user-friendly. But should we view them right now, these big companies like Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, are we on the same side anymore with them? They like, what I'm afraid is that in order for them to exist, they have to compromise because it's a political thing. So with their compromise, they will create regulations that would allow them to survive, but probably will block the next Uber who would replace them. And we are not for Uber. We are for the process of the market, that if a better Uber comes up, we shouldn't protect Uber or taxi or whatever you want to call it. So I'm asking, are we on the same side with them right now?
The last, in this book here, in order to make, the last chapter is called Destroying Uber, the Creative Destructor. And it's exactly about that. That's why I am always very afraid of trying to define the sharing economy as something special. I just say, these are businesses, let them do what they have to do, and we are not on the side of the one agent. We should not be taking sides with a one agent. We should allow everyone to flourish. However, if they try to co-opt regulators, if they try to capture regulation, we can be moderately sure that with time, even newer creative destructor will come and will try to challenge the position of the new establishment. Of course, it always takes time. But I agree with you, we should not be taking their side, and we should not be pro-Uber, pro-Airbnb, we should just be pro-free market.
Let me remark on that as well, that many of the people who don't like Uber, I'm on the island of Bali a lot, and there's a big contest between the established drivers and Uber, and they've beaten these guys up and attacked them. And a lot of the tourist expats are on the side of the locals because they view Uber as this evil corporate they're anti-capitalist, okay? And so one has to be a little bit nuanced about your question and how you respond to them, because I think, as you say, we need to defend the model and not the company, but it may take a bit of nuance, because I get into these debates with these long-haired utopian expats that well, we need to drive these evil corporations out of business.
We're small resourced groups normally. You take your allies where you can find them. And so, for instance, Lyft is on Uber's competitor in the United States, is very much on the right side of the unionization issue. The city of Seattle is trying to force Uber drivers into unions, and Lyft is challenging that in the courts, and we work with them to help that. Lyft is very much on the wrong side when it comes to, they want to create a new highly regulated portable benefits system that employees can take around. So we're fighting them on that. But I think you have to take your allies where you can find them on individual issues. Doesn't mean you'll always agree with them, and sometimes you may actually be fighting them.
I finally agree with you on something.
I mean, if I could just invite us to relate this series of presentations and discussion this afternoon to what was happening this morning as moderated by Daniel. The idea of us all being here to try to work out a series of kind of core principles to link together, all think tanks. I would invite you to consider just dropping this subject. There's enough disagreement anyway. Also, I know it's a global topic, Uber, but I'm pretty sure that two of my friends in London who've been working on Uber there are right. It's easy for us all to be confused by this wonderful little sexy technology, seeing the car come towards you when you're at the airport. I'm convinced by this fellow that Bob Liddon, that the real reason for Uber's success is having smart lawyers getting on the right side of the employment law. So in the UK, national insurance, a form of kind of employers' income tax is 11%. The Uber so far don't pay that. There's enough there evaluated, Ian. That's the reason why Uber exists. If they had to pay that 11%, they couldn't possibly justify the gazillions they've had to put into their brand. And the other thing is you mentioned blockchain. I mean, this is right into my subject. So I'm working on currency redesign and so forth. Everything to do with cryptocurrencies is sheer garbage. Blockchain is something that's emanated from a garbage currency, Bitcoin. Blockchain is a technology looking for a problem to solve. Banks love it. Banks are constantly wanting to pretend to policymakers and regulators that they're doing something clever, keeping up with the digital Joneses to go forward. There's absolutely nothing there.
Do you have any other questions? Yeah, Bob, I think.
Iain, I'd just like you to respond to the critique of your presentation delineating firms and platforms.
That's all.
Yeah. No, of course, Uber is a firm in the traditional Coasian sense, but what it's doing is empowering people to be individual businessmen, and so in that respect, it is different from a firm that is selling a product directly. If we do go down this road of recognizing Uber as an employer and having them pay national insurance contributions and so on, then all you're doing is raising transaction costs for the businessmen who are using the platform. I think that's a road I don't want to go down. I want to be reducing transaction costs and have more economic transactions amongst individuals. There's always going to be a role for the firm. There are, as Henrique says, some things which probably can't be platformized in this way. But if we're reducing economic transaction costs, we're increasing economic transactions and we're increasing wealth. And that's overall, that's the benefit of the sharing economy, as far as I can tell. It has a potential. It may not be there yet, but has a potential to significantly increase wealth and human welfare.
Also,
yes, of course.
I am a pain in the ass with the definition thing because it tends to create groups, and I don't like grouping things because every business is an individual business. But think of very legacy establishment businesses that also work as a platform. Just they are not platforms, they have some platform component to them. You go to a football stadium, you saw they sell all these advertisement space. They are a platform for advertisement. You go to the plane, and if you fly in America, in the plane they are selling gardening tools. It's not the airline selling gardening tools, it's some gardening guy selling gardening tools, but using the airline as a platform. So the idea that there is a platform and then there is another kind of firm, it's not true. There is a blurry line because every business is individual. It can choose how to operate, and that is why I think we should not try to create groups, but we should maximize liberty.
I know you're coming from a banking background, but I admire your straight-talking quality, which I try to emulate myself. But I do think you have a point about, like, given the discussion this morning and how momentous it is, I do find it slightly frustrating with libertarian gatherings, free market gatherings, that there is this focus on Bitcoin, blockchain, kind of in a theoretic discussion. And even though I just said there that I thought sharing economies is a new frontier, I think, I hope I'm not contradicting myself by also saying that when I said to you about public sector pay and meat and veg every day, man in the street, woman in the street, there are a bit more basic issues. So these are issues which kind of are exciting, and we go into rooms and we talk about blockchain, and you know, I was at a Students for Liberty event in Dublin, and it's kind of all they talked about. And I said, guys, you know, if you're going to win the centre-right libertarian message, it has to be bread and butter, pay, private sector. So I'm just echoing your point there. Yeah.
The audience has taken over the panel.
Very briefly. I mean, look, if you go back, say, let's go back, I'm so old, let's go back to the mid-1990s, the period 1995 to 2007. People didn't understand, people have never understood what's going on in banking unless they've been inside the banking kind of bubble. The only business going on in Barclays and several other banks, and frankly, I was heavily involved in this too, is basically tax optimization. That means, as a mega global bank, ensuring that your bank never pays a penny of tax. Hence all these double dip, triple dip leasing deals. The degree of brain power, some of the most intelligent people on planet Earth, designing a system whereby a plane would fly through Japan, that would be American registered, nobody pays tax. And then in fact you get a tax claim back from 2 other jurisdictions where the plane never visits. Then of course you have some problem with Take That singers and some film deals, and then all of a sudden 7 years ago it's a hanging offence ever to have avoided a penny of tax. And so, surprise, surprise, all the banks who have been bailed out say, that's fine, we love paying tax. And of course, the situation you end up with is that none of them have a viable business model. And Barclays Bank's share price now trades at something like 50% price to book value. The difficulty with think tanks embracing things like Uber and these issues and blockchain without necessarily completely understanding them, seeing some massive global businesses grow up with some unintended consequences 8 years down the road, where no doubt it'll be seen to be too dangerous to allow Uber to fail. We'll all be bailing them out in 2025.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that you know, when it comes to things like you know, fintech and so on, why is fintech suddenly the area where everybody's interested in it? It's because banks are so heavily regulated that they can't make money any other way. Well,
it's all being financed by the bailout money. There's no money going into fintech other than these banks.
It may be very different. If you've seen Dodd-Frank in the US, that's significant, heavy regulation on the banks.
Capital requirements have a huge impact in the way that the Basel III regulations impact on banks' choices of their asset. It has a huge impact on their operations.
And indeed, the big banks have been gaming because they've been because they were bailed out. The small,
there's a nice little cozy relationship between banks and regulators. We don't start.
yeah, no, there is, but small banks in the US are being wiped out by regulation.
There's a situation going on in Europe where regulators have actually not imposing capital rules on certain banks, because if they did so, they'd have to reveal their insolvency.
Every rule is gameable. That is why if you have a lot of rules, you have a lot of market distortion, because then people and businesses are not about making money anymore, they're about gaming the rules, which is fun but not good.
Probably banking is massive saturation, far too many banks in the market to be very there's no creative destruction. They're all being done.
And that's why we're trying to get Dodd-Frank repealed, because Dodd-Frank had okay. Well, we got somewhat off subject here, but is there anybody any remaining questions on the sharing economy?
I'm sharing. We have.
Hi. Question maybe a bit more pessimistic with regards to tech. A lot of these sharing economy apps have a rating system. Now I just wonder that if you're like an authoritarian regime, this is actually quite interesting. Opens a lot of possibilities. just want to hear your opinion on that. Like, will the market develop technology to counter that, or should we actually be a bit wary of using all that kind of stuff? For example, if they take all the Airbnb data and then link it with their tax system, they can say, oh, but you claim that you've actually been living there, but we can find out that this is not the case, this is domicile fraud. Just giving one example, I mean, I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for authoritarian regimes and politicians back home.
Yes, I think that's a major risk, and but that's because we live in a surveillance society, I think, and we need to tackle the problem of surveillance and government burrowing into everything, rather than worry about it specifically for the sharing economy. Best way to do that, I think, is just to massively slash the size of government, so they can't do that.
And often these governments suffocate themselves with data. You know, the Soviets and the Stasi and all, they had endless amounts of data, but they couldn't, you can't process it all, even now, I think. You know, so, but that could be in the inner limit to their capacities. But it's an interesting question. Right.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, well, some of you have mentioned already the blockchain issue. Everybody knows Uber, but I don't know how many people are familiar with Arcade City or similar developments, which I don't know whether they are going well or have been a complete failure. I don't know. But the point is that we are now considering platforms which are centralized. And as time goes by, I believe that not only in the sharing economy, but also in social media, platforms will be decentralized and organized through peer-to-peer technologies, whether it is blockchain or something else. So what will happen is that we are considering the firms as the stakeholder for pro-free market, for the pro-free market community to liaise with, which is okay by now. But I believe that in a few years, probably, there will not be a centralized firm we can talk to. There will be no Uber. So we should prepare to work for the whole real entrepreneurial community, which is made up by the users of Uber and not by Uber. Uber might disappear, and still there will be a community of users who will use something else that will be decentralized and will not have an address and a CEO. So, I don't know, this is just a concern.
The more algorithms and the more artificial intelligence we have, the better it goes. For example, the internet has no CEO. We cannot call the CEO of the internet. It's just a large community of nodes interacting, and that can happen on economics, on economic level too. I agree with that. However, it's still a thing for the market to develop.
Yes, I agree completely. It's, as I said earlier, it's all about transaction costs. If you get those transaction costs down enough, eventually Uber itself is a transaction cost. I think time for one final question from Josh.
Okay, thanks. I hope this isn't a diversion, but I think Peter raises a very important point here. I used to be scornful of libertarians who were paranoid about the surveillance state. I thought we needed surveillance to keep us safe. I still believe we do, but there is a very real problem. The NSA doesn't need to process all the information, they just need to store it. And then when they want to go after particular enemies, such as the Donald Trump administration, they go into that information and find out what they need and use it for political purposes. I thought that would never happen in the United States. It's now happened. To general shrugging of the shoulders by the mainstream media as if there was no scandal there to watch at all. In the digital economy, every move we make, we're geolocated at every moment. Every transaction we make, increasingly, I don't really have any cash on me. Most everything I spend and everything I do is recorded somewhere. And I actually do think, and again, I know this can very easily shade off into paranoia, but I actually do think that that's a very real problem.
Well, I think that'll draw the session to a close. Let's continue the conversation about blockchain and banks during the coffee break. Thanks. Thank you very much, everyone.